What if the most feared monster in the palace was never a monster at all? For months, the Alpha King's son was locked behind iron doors, chained beneath ancient seals, and feared by everyone who heard his roar. Warriors refused to enter. Elders demanded he be sealed away forever. Even his own father no longer knew how to reach him. Then one servant girl walked into the forbidden room with no weapon, no command, and no fear strong enough to stop her. And when the prince lunged at her, she laughed. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's begin the story. The first time the palace trembled, everyone pretended it was the wind. Shadow and Stone were good at hiding things in Shadow Rest, good at swallowing the truth and returning only echoes. But no corridor, no lock, no prayer carved into the black walls could swallow the sound that ripped through the Draven citadel that night. A roar, not the clean, controlled roar of an alpha staking a claim, not the ritual call that made banners flutter and lesser wolves lower their eyes. This was raw. It hit the great stone hall like a hammer rolled through the pillars, rattled the iron sconces, and made torchlight shiver as if the flames were suddenly afraid of what they served. Dust sifted down from the vaulted ceiling in thin gray veils, and beneath the sound, if you listened closely, if you dared to listen, you could hear something else braided through it. Panic, the kind that doesn't belong to monsters, the kind that belongs to someone trapped. A thick iron door deep in the inner corridor bucked in its frame as if something inside had thrown itself against it. Chains heavy over forged links designed for prisoners and beasts snapped taut and whined. The reinforced hinges screamed. The runic seals painted across the metal pulsed a faint, sickly light like breath on the edge of failing. Two warriors stumbled backward from the forbidden hall, half dragged by their comrades. One clutched his forearm, blood seeping between his fingers in narrow lines. The other had bite marks on his shoulder plate, where metal had been dented inward as if something with jaws far too strong had tried to eat its way through steel. Their faces were pale under the firelight, eyes-wide pupils too large. A young guard pressed his back to the wall and whispered, voice shaking so hard the words came out broken. It's starting again. Nobody answered him because nobody wanted to agree out loud. No one approached the door. They stood in a half circle down the corridor. Fighters, veterans, men who had survived border wars and rogue sieges and winter hunts that swallowed entire patrols. And still they held their distance from that one threshold like it was the mouth of a cave that had already eaten too many. Fear did that. It reorganized hierarchy in a way rank never could. Inside the locked chamber, the roar rose again, not one sound, but a storm of sounds. A snarling inhale, a choked exhale, a guttural growl that fractured into something almost like a cry. Something struck the door again. The seals flickered. The chains rattled, pulled so tight the links vibrated. If you had asked any of those guards what they were guarding, they would have said the same word, monster. And if you had asked them who, they would have lowered their voices further, the Alpha King's son. Upstairs behind reinforced glass and carved stone, the council chamber smelled like cold incense and restrained dread. 30 elders representatives from the most powerful packs in the Northern Territories stood in a ring around an obsidian table that had been in shadow rest, longer than most bloodlines had been pure. Their robes were heavy, their insignias gleamed, their eyes were sharp and tired and cruelly practical. They listened to the distant roaring as if it were a report being delivered. An elder with iron gray hair spoke first. His voice held no warmth, only calculation. We cannot continue to allow that thing to exist within these walls. That thing. The words were deliberate. Not child, not prince, not Rowan. A second elder cut in jaw said, "It is no longer the heir. It is a threat." The phrase moved around the circle like a confirmation passed hand to hand without needing to be questioned. Heads dipped, hands tightened on carved walking staffs. A few glanced toward the door as if expecting the sound itself to enter and lay waste to dignity. Someone else, a woman with frost-colored eyes, said flatly, "Permanent sealing." Another voice, older, harsher, added, "Or execution," quietly, before it kills someone important. A brief silence followed, the kind that doesn't come from shock but from agreement settling into place. No one protested, not because they were heartless. No, most of them would have claimed they were saving lives. And in a palace where politics could be as deadly as claws saving lives was the closest thing to righteousness anyone could afford. Still, I have watched enough courts, human and wolf alike, to recognize this pattern. When people are afraid, they become moral accountants. They start measuring danger like numbers. A child becomes a risk becomes a decision becomes something they call necessity, so they can live with it afterward. That is how monsters are made. The council door opened without fanfare. No announcement, no herald, but the chamber fell instantly silent anyway. Alpha King Kale Draven stepped inside. He was tall enough that even the elders looked slightly upward and broad enough that his coat hung on him, like a shadow trying to imitate a mountain. Silver threaded through his black hair at the temples. His face carried the kind of stillness predators have when they're deciding whether to pounce. And his eyes, mostly brown tonight, but flecked with gold in the torchlight, scanned the room with the precision of someone who'd learned long ago that power isn't loud. It's inevitable. He didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. And Elder Rathos, the loudest and oldest among them, broke the silence with a sentence shaped like a verdict. "You know we are right, Your Majesty." Kyle's gaze didn't even flicker at the man. It moved past the table, past the elders, toward the far wall where the palace's inner corridors lay. Even here, the roar could be heard, dulled by distance, but still unmistakable, still vibrating through stone like a heartbeat that refused to calm. Kyle spoke at last, slowly, voice deep enough to make the air feel heavier. "He is my son." Rathos didn't flinch, and he can kill anyone in this room. A few elders shifted. It was one thing to condemn a prince from a safe chamber. It was another to imagine that prince tearing through council robes and rank like paper. Kale's hands clenched at his sides, tight enough that the tendons stood out, tight enough that if he'd been a lesser wolf, his claws might have bared. But he held himself with an alpha's discipline. His expression remained controlled. "I have tried everything." He didn't list it. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew the report trainers. Healers, handlers, restraints, sedation, punishment, prayer. Nothing worked. Rowan's episodes had only grown worse. There was a heavy pause. Then Kale's voice dropped, almost quieter than the roar far below. "I can control this kingdom." He exhaled, and the sound carried something that almost didn't belong in an alpha's throat. "But I cannot make him calm." That sentence was a crack. Not in his authority, not in his power, in his fatherhood. And if you think an alpha king cannot be broken by something as simple as a child he cannot reach, then you have never seen what happens when the strongest wolf in a territory meets the one creature he cannot command without destroying. Downstairs, far from council chambers and obsidian tables, there was another world in Shadow Rest. A world of scrubbed floors and carried trays of bowed heads and swallowed words. A world where power moved above like weather, and servants learned to stay invisible to survive it. Leora Vale lived in that lower world. She knelt in a dim corridor, the stone beneath her palms cold and damp, scrubbing mud from the floor where warriors had tracked it in. Her fingers were raw, her sleeves smelled faintly of soap and ash. Her hair was braided tight, not for beauty, but for practicality. Loose hair was something a desperate hand could grab. Other servants passed her without looking. Guards leaned on spears and pretended she was part of the architecture. That was how you survived in a palace like this. You became so ordinary that even cruelty got bored. The roar came again. Leora's hand paused mid-scrub. Not from fear. That's what the others would have expected. That's what the palace assumed of someone like her Omega-born servant ranked. Trained from childhood to flinch when alphas raised their voices. But Leora didn't flinch. She listened. It's hard to explain the difference between listening and hearing, but it matters. Hearing is what your ears do. Listening is what your heart chooses. Leora tilted her head slightly as if trying to make sense of the sound, the way you'd make sense of a language you didn't speak but recognized as grief. A servant girl hurried past her, arms loaded with linens, and muttered without slowing, "Don't look toward that hall. Bad luck." Leora didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the inner corridor where the air felt heavier, colder, where the torchlight always seemed to dim no matter how many flames were lit. A metal tray sat near the forbidden door. Food, untouched. Leora stared at it, then at the thick iron barrier with chains coiled around it like a serpent. She rose slowly, not quickly, not dramatically, just as if her body had decided something before her mind could talk it out of doing so. A guard stood near the door, one of Marcus Varn's men, a broad-shouldered beta with a scar down his cheek that looked like it came from something with claws. Leora approached to a respectful distance and asked softly, "Has he not eaten?" The guard's eyes narrowed as if she'd spoken heresy. "That's not your concern." Leora kept her gaze on the tray. The food had gone cold enough that even the scent of broth was dull. "If he doesn't eat," she said, voice gentle but clear, "his stomach will hurt." The guard snorted, irritated. "You don't understand. That thing will tear you apart." Leora fell silent for a moment. Not because she was intimidated, but because she was weighing what he'd said against what she'd heard. Then she asked, almost casually, as if confirming a detail, "But he's still a child, isn't he?" The guard didn't answer. He looked away toward the corridor, toward safety, toward the lie that if you didn't name something, you didn't have to feel it. That silence told her everything. Leora's fingers curled around the edge of the tray. A servant nearby gasped. "What are you doing?" Leora lifted it. Her hands didn't shake. "Taking it in." The other servant's face went white. "Are you insane?" Leora didn't respond. She stepped toward the door. The guard moved, immediately blocking her path. "No." Leora lowered her head in the proper sign of deference, not because she agreed, because she knew how doors worked in this palace, how you could push the right one open if you didn't slam your shoulder against it. "I won't do anything dangerous," she said. The guard gave a humorless laugh. "Everyone says that before they die." Leora lifted her eyes. They weren't defiant. They weren't pleading. They were simply steady. "I just don't want him to be hungry." It wasn't a heroic line. It wasn't brave in the way songs describe bravery. It was almost offensively simple. And that's why it landed like a stone dropped into still water. Because in a palace obsessed with power, the most radical thing in the world was a person who cared without calculating the cost. The guard hesitated. His jaw flexed. He looked toward the door as if it might leap at him too. Behind him, the chains rattled again. A deeper roar rolled through the metal. The guard swallowed. He signaled to another soldier, "Get Marcus." He didn't say, "Stop her." He didn't say, "Arrest her." He simply stalled. The oldest instinct of anyone who had ever been afraid, "If I delay long enough, maybe someone else will decide." But Leora didn't give the palace time to decide for her. She stepped forward. The guard cursed under his breath and began undoing the outer chain, only one layer, carefully like a man removing a lid from a pot he believed might explode. The metal groaned, the lock clicked, the door opened a handspan. A wave of air rolled out hot, sour with sweat, and laced with the metallic tang of blood and old fear. The guards recoiled instinctively. Hands went to weapons. Leora didn't step back. She pushed the door wider and walked in. The room beyond was dim. No windows, only a thin stripe of light from the corridor fell across the stone floor like a blade. Something moved low to the ground. A rumbling growl rose from the dark not far away. Too close. Leora's breath caught just once, but she forced her shoulders down. She kept her body loose. She remembered something older than rank and fear predators read tension like a book. She took one step, another. Then Rowan lunged. He was bigger than any child had a right to be, overgrown, all muscle and sharp angles. His eyes flashed in the strip of light crimson in the dark. His teeth were too white. His breath came fast, a storm of sound, and in one violent motion he clamped his jaws around Leora's sleeve. Outside the corridor erupted. Pull her out. Now steel scraped steel, someone shouted orders, someone else prayed. But inside the room, time slowed to the stretch between heartbeat and heartbeat. Rowan didn't shake her like prey. He held. He pinned her sleeve with his teeth, as if anchoring himself to something he wasn't sure was real. The fabric tightened. A soft, tearing sound came from the seam. Leora didn't yank away. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the tray. She looked down, not at his teeth, but at his eyes. And there it was, under the fury, under the dominance, instincts twisted into defense. A flicker of hesitation, a question. As if Rowan had thrown his whole body into being terrifying, and now he was waiting for the world to respond the way it always did. Fear, violence, abandonment. One of the guards outside whispered, voice cold with certainty, "It's over." But Leora did something no one expected. She shifted her weight, lowered her center of gravity just enough to steady herself. She let 2 seconds pass. Rowan's growl dipped, changed pitch like a creature confused that its threat hadn't landed yet. Then Leora tugged back. Not hard, not aggressive, not the violent jerk that would trigger a kill response. Just a steady, playful resistance. Rowan froze. Leora tilted her head slightly, and the corner of her mouth lifted. She smiled. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was the kind of smile you give a stubborn child tugging on your coat in a market because they want you to look at something. And then she laughed, soft surprise, like the sound had escaped her before she could remember she was supposed to be afraid. "If you want a bite?" she murmured, voice low and warm, then pull back. Rowan didn't understand the words, or maybe he did in the only language a child raised in isolation could still speak movement, tone, and tension. He didn't release her, but he didn't attack further either. Leora tugged again. Rowan reacted, tugged back. A loop formed. Pull, resist, pull. Resist. Outside the corridor went silent with disbelief. A guard stammered. What is she doing?" Inside. Rowan's growl shifted less like a warning, more like a frustrated sound of exertion. He pulled harder. Leora let herself sway as if giving him the win for a heartbeat, then tugged back again. "Good," she whispered, as if praising a lesson. "Like that." Rowan made a sound that wasn't a roar. It was short, breathy, almost a chuff, almost laughter. I want you to understand how impossible that moment felt in the palace's logic. Shadow Rest was a place where power was the answer to everything. Dominance solved problems, force made order, fear maintained hierarchy, and here was a low-ranked servant turning the most feared creature in the palace into a child playing tug-of-war with a sleeve. What made the wild beast inside that boy pause and choose to play instead of attack. Tell me what you think in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe before we dive into the most powerful part of the story. It wasn't magic. It was the first time Rowan's body had been allowed to choose something other than defense. Somewhere in the corridor behind the guards, a presence shifted the air. Kyle Draven had arrived without anyone noticing. That was an alpha thing moving like a shadow until you decided to be seen. He stood in the back of the crowd, half in darkness. He didn't give orders, he didn't announce himself. His gaze locked on the crack of the door where he could see his son's shape and the thin line of Leora's arm. He watched, his jaw clenched, not with anger but with a war inside him. Every instinct screamed to drag the Omega servant out and lock the door again. Protect her, protect everyone. But he didn't move, because for the first time in months, he wasn't watching a threat. He was watching Rowan, not the monster the council described, not the liability the kingdom feared. Rowan the child. Kale's voice came out so quiet it barely existed. That's him. He sounded almost like he didn't believe it. Leora kept pulling, kept smiling. Rowan kept tugging, his eyes no longer purely red with rage, but bright with something else, something alive. After a few minutes, Rowan released her sleeve. Not violently, not as a predator letting go of prey, more like a child who'd finished a game and wasn't sure what came next. Leora didn't take the moment to run. She didn't scramble backward. She didn't do the thing everyone always did. Retreat in terror and reinforce Rowan's belief that closeness ended in disappearance. She sat down right there on the cold stone floor. The tray clinked softly as she set it down. Rowan stared at her, head tilted. Leora slid the tray toward him a few inches, careful not to shove it like an offering to a beast. "Eat," she said simply. "Then we can play again." Rowan didn't move. He watched her face as if trying to find the trick. Leora held his gaze without challenge. She didn't look away in submission. She didn't stare him down in dominance. She simply stayed present. After a long beat, Rowan lowered his head and ate, not with the savage frenzy everyone expected. Not tearing, not snarling, just eating. Slow at first, like he didn't trust the food to remain, like he expected someone to yank it away. Then faster hunger, overriding suspicion. Outside, Dr. Celine Varel pushed forward through the stunned guards. She was a royal physician, her robe smelling faintly of herbs and antiseptic. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with professional astonishment. "He's eating," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. Marcus Varn arrived moments later, his heavy footsteps clipped, controlled. He took in the scene with one sweeping glance, the torn sleeve the Omega servant seated on stone, the prince eating the Alpha King standing in shadow. Marcus's voice was grim. "Only because she's there. Celine didn't look away from Rowan. Only because she's safe." It's worth noting this is where stories usually lie. They make the servant girl fearless, as if courage is the absence of fear. But Leora's hands were tense where they rested on her knees. Her pulse had to be hammering. Her throat was probably dry. She was afraid. She simply refused to let fear dictate her next action. Rowan finished the food and licked the last of the broth from the tray, then glanced at Leora again, watchful, wary, as if waiting for the punishment that always followed hunger. Leora picked up the end of her torn sleeve and wiggled it slightly like bait. "You want that again?" she asked. Rowan's lips peeled back, teeth showing. The corridor outside tensed, but Leora only smiled wider. "Go on, pull." Rowan lunged, not with the full force of attack, but with the messy enthusiasm of a child who'd discovered a game. His jaws closed around fabric. Leora tugged back. "Pull, resist, pull." Rowan's growl lifted into that breathy chuff again. And somewhere behind the guards, Cale Draven's chest did something strange, something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten it existed. Relief, not victory, not control, relief. The next day, Leora came back. No one had officially allowed it, no order had been spoken. But in Shadowrest, silence from an Alpha King could be permission in its own right. Rowan waited near the door, not pressing against it violently, not slamming his body into chains, just there. When the door opened and Leora stepped inside, Rowan's posture shifted. His shoulders loosened the smallest fraction. The red in his eyes didn't flare. He didn't roar. He watched her. Leora held up a thin length of cloth, a makeshift rope she'd braided from old rags the kind servants used to tie bundles. She dragged it across the floor in a quick, erratic line. Rowan's head snapped toward it. Leora kept her voice light. No biting my sleeve today. Chase this instead. Rowan pounced. The motion was clumsy at first, his body too big for his age, his limbs not fully coordinated. He slid on the stone and recovered with a frustrated snarl. Leora laughed genuine. Again she urged. Rowan tried again. This time he caught the rope and shook it, then looked at her as if to say, "What now?" Leora tugged. Rowan tugged back. Outside the door, the guards listened to something they had not heard in that corridor for months. Not roaring, not chains screaming, laughter, or something close enough to make the difference irrelevant. Over the next days, the pattern formed. Leora arrived with food. Rowan ate. Leora played. Rowan chased. Leora stayed until Rowan's breathing slowed, and then something even more impossible happened. Rowan began to sleep, not in the deep, drugged stupor the healers had once forced upon him with sedatives. Those had only made him wake raging, confused, terrified. This was natural. One afternoon, after a long session of rope chasing and tugging, Rowan collapsed near the wall where Leora always sat. He didn't touch her, but he lay close enough that his warmth reached her legs. Leora leaned back against stone, barely moving. "Sleep," she whispered. "I'm still here." Rowan's eyes fluttered, his breathing slowed, his body always coiled, always ready to strike, finally loosened like a fist unclenching. He slept. And outside in the corridor, Cale Draven stood watching through the narrow observation slit. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stared at the sight of his son, his dangerous, impossible son, sleeping peacefully beside a servant girl whose name most of the palace hadn't bothered to learn. Kyle's voice came out rough, like it had to scrape past something sharp inside him. What did she do? No one answered because no one could explain it in the palace's language. Power hadn't done it. Threats hadn't done it. Chains hadn't done it. Only presence, only trust, only a quiet laugh in the face of fear. And if you want my honest author's confession, this is the moment I always return to when I think about what healing actually looks like. Not dramatic, not clean, not triumphant. Healing is a person sitting on a cold floor and choosing not to leave even when leaving would be easier, safer, more reasonable. Healing is a child learning slowly, painfully, that closeness doesn't always end in abandonment. As the torchlight flickered in the corridor and the palace finally briefly stopped shaking, Cale Draven realized a truth more dangerous than any monster. The problem had never been that Rowan was untrainable. The problem was that everyone had approached him like a monster first. And now for the first time, Cale couldn't look away from the one person who had done the opposite. Rumors in Shadowrest didn't spread like wildfire. They spread like frost, silent, patient, unstoppable. At first, the palace had only whispered about the locked wing, about the iron door that bucked and screamed, about the chains that never seemed to rest, about the prince, whose name no one said aloud anymore because names made things real? Rowan Draven. For weeks, the rumor had been simple. The Alpha King's son is a monster. Then Leora Vale walked into that room and laughed. Not because she was reckless, not because she didn't know fear, but because she heard something in Rowan's roar that everyone else refused to hear a child's panic dressed up in teeth. After that, the rumor changed. It always does when the world can't deny a miracle, but also can't accept it without suspicion. Now the palace whispered something new. The monster listens to the servant. And in Shadow Rest, that was somehow more terrifying than the monster itself. The council chamber smelled of cold stone and old authority. Elder Rathos slammed a palm down on the table so hard the obsidian surface rang like a bell. A nameless servant has no right to enter the prince's confinement every day. Around the ring, elders murmured in agreement. Some looked offended, as if Leora's presence near the royal bloodline stained the air itself. Others looked anxious, calculating political fallout. One elder leaned forward, voice sharp as a knife. If the prince obeys only her, then she holds the royal family's weakness in her hands. Dr. Celine Virel, royal physician healer, and the only one in the room who looked at Rowan's records like they belonged to a child instead of a threat, kept her voice steady. It isn't control. Rowan responds to safety. This is the first genuine progress we've seen in months. Rathos's eyes cut to her hard and unyielding. Progress, he repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. Or dependency. Marcus Varn stood near the wall like a shadow carved into armor. His scarred face was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed that he'd been thinking the same thought all night and hated himself for it. I don't like admitting it, Marcus said at last, but yes, the prince only allows her close. The council seized on that sentence like wolves on a fresh kill. Then we remove her before it's too late. Kyle Draven sat at the head of the table, his expression a mask of calm, but his hand resting on the arm of his chair tightened until the wood creaked. Rathos turned toward him with the confident cruelty of a man who believed rank belonged to tradition more than to the one who wore it. Your Majesty, you are the Alpha King, not a soft father. If Rowan is to inherit, he must learn to answer the call of blood, of pack of command, not cling to a servant girl. Kyle lifted his gaze slowly. The gold in his eyes flared just enough to make the nearest elders swallow. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Choose your words carefully, he said. Rathos bowed his head but didn't retreat. I speak only what the kingdom is thinking. And that, I think, is the most dangerous kind of enemy in a court, the one who hides brutality behind the word kingdom as if it absolves everything. Leora was summoned that same afternoon. She entered the council chamber with her head bowed in the proper posture of a servant, but her spine straight. She wore the plain dress of the lower staff. Her sleeves still carried the old tear from Rowan's first bite mended, but visible if you knew where to look. Some elders stared at her as if she were dirt tracked into sacred ground. Rathos didn't waste time on politeness. What have you done to the Prince? Leora kept her voice calm. I brought him food, I played with him, I stayed when he was afraid. An elder scoffed. Prince Draven is not afraid. Leora lifted her eyes, not challenging, not insolent, just honest. Then why is the door locked from the outside? The room fell silent for a single heartbeat. Marcus's gaze flicked toward her surprise, cutting through his usual stone. Rathos's face darkened. You have exceeded your station. I know my station, Leora said softly. That's why I never ordered him. I never demanded anything. I only sat down. Rathos turned to Kel, triumphant. You see, she forgets who she is. Kyle's eyes stayed on Leora. It struck him, perhaps struck everyone in the room, that she stood alone among power and did not shrink. Leora Kale asked, voice controlled, "Do you believe Rowan is dangerous?" "Yes." The single word rippled through the council like shock. Even Celine blinked, but Leora didn't flinch from what she'd said. She continued, voice gentle but unshakable. "Dangerous does not mean unlovable." Kyle went still. That sentence hit him like a blade slid carefully between ribs, not violent but precise, because it named the truth he'd been trying to bury under chains and seals. "I locked my son away because I feared him, and I feared him because I did not know how to love him without breaking everything." Rathos snapped, "Enough. You will not poison our air with softness." Leora's hands curled once at her sides. She didn't argue, she didn't plead, but her eyes briefly met Kale's. And Kale, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, found himself looking away. Only for a fraction of a second, just long enough for her to understand. Just long enough for him to hate himself for it. The order came down like winter. Leora was forbidden from entering the prince's wing. Forbidden from bringing food, forbidden from bringing toys, rope, anything that had become Rowan's fragile bridge toward the world. Dr. Celine protested immediately. "If we cut contact suddenly, he may panic. You cannot treat this like breaking a bad habit. This is severance." Rathos cut in. "If he is heir, he must endure." Kyle said nothing, not because he agreed, because somewhere deep inside him a darker fear whispered, "If Rowan only needs her, what does that make me?" Leora's face paled, but she didn't beg for herself. She asked only once, voice quiet, "At least let me tell him one sentence." Rathos's response was ice. "No. Dependency must be cut clean." Leora looked again to Kale. Kale avoided her eyes just for a breath. And when she spoke, her words carried a distance that hurt more than accusation. "Yes, Your Majesty." The phrase "Your Majesty" had never sounded colder. That evening, Leora still walked to the iron door out of habit, out of instinct, out of a promise she hadn't gotten to speak aloud. She carried a bowl of warm porridge and the old braided cloth rope Rowan loved. Her steps were steady, but her heart pounded so loud she thought the guards might hear it. Marcus stood in front of the door. "You can't go in." Leora stopped. Her fingers tightened around the rope. "He's waiting." Marcus didn't meet her eyes. "It's an order." From behind the iron barrier came a faint sound, soft at first, then sharper. Scratch, scratch. Rowan's claws on stone. Leora stepped forward one pace. "Rowan," she called, voice low but clear. "I'm here." The door shuttered. Marcus raised a hand signaling two guards. "Take her." Leora resisted only enough to twist toward the door, not to fight them, to be heard. "Rowan, listen to me," she said louder. "I'm not leaving you." The guards dragged her back. From inside, a roar erupted. Not the old raging roar. This one cracked. It broke mid-sound like something tearing. A panicked, fractured cry dressed as fury. Leora fought to turn her head. "Don't let him think I walked away," she pleaded. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Take her downstairs," he ordered, voice rough. The door behind them slammed again and again as Rowan threw his body against it. And I want to pause here because this is where most people misunderstand children who lash out. They think anger is the emotion. They think violence is the truth. But violence is often a language for the thing that came first. Rowan wasn't raging because he hated them. Rowan was raging because he believed the only person who stayed had been taken away. The sealed wing shook within minutes. Rowan slammed into the door, not with the precise intent of an attacker trying to reach prey, but with desperate, reckless force, like someone trying to break through walls that had always won. The runic seals flared and flickered, struggling. His roar stretched into a long, painful sound. that scraped the throat raw. A guard stumbled backward, white-faced. "He's gone mad." Dr. Celine rushed in, peering through the observation slit. The color drained from her face. Rowan wasn't looking for a way out. He ran circles around the chamber claws, scoring grooves into stone. He knocked over the food tray someone had dared to set down, then skidded to the corner where Leora always sat. He lowered his head, pressing his nose to the floor, searching. No scent, no warmth, no promise. He lifted his head, and the next roar choked halfway through into something that sounded too much like grief. Celine grabbed Marcus's arm, urgent. "This isn't rage. It's separation panic." Marcus frowned. "Explain." Celine stared at Rowan, voice trembling despite her training. "He thinks he's been abandoned again." Rowan threw himself into the wall, not to escape, just because his body had too much pain and nowhere to put it. Celine's voice broke. "Stop. You'll hurt yourself." Marcus didn't hesitate anymore. "Get the Alpha King." Kyle arrived, fast cloak half fastened his face, a storm held behind glass. He went straight to the observation slit. Inside Rowan was a blur of motion, corner to corner, wall to wall. Then suddenly still, hunched, trembling. Then moving again, frantic. Then back to the corner. Kyle stood motionless. Celine spoke softly beside him. "He isn't trying to break free, he's searching for her." Kale didn't answer. Rowan clawed the floor again, then let out a small sound, almost a whimper, so quiet Kyle almost didn't hear it. Kyle's eyes shut for a second. He remembered every moment he'd stood outside this door and told himself he was protecting the palace. He remembered ordering more chains, more guards, more seals, more distance. And he realized with a sick twist in his chest that he had never once sat down beside his son, never once offered presence instead of restraint. Kyle's voice came out hoarse. "I thought if I kept him in there, everyone would be safe." Celine's reply was gentle, devastating. Maybe their bodies were safe, but Rowan's mind wasn't. Marcus fell silent. Even his soldier's certainty didn't survive that truth. Kyle stared at Rowan, at the trembling, panicked child too big for his age. For the first time, he did not see a threat. He saw a boy left alone with his own instincts until the instincts became his cage. Rathos arrived, breath sharp, still clinging to authority like armor. "Do not open the door," he snapped. "This is proof he cannot be controlled." Kyle turned slowly. The gold in his eyes brightened. Rathos pressed on, emboldened. "If you allow the servant back in, you confirm dependency. You show the kingdom that the heir has a weakness. You weaken the throne." Kyle stepped closer, not growling, not threatening, just present, and the corridor seemed to freeze. "My son is not the throne," Kyle said quietly. Rathos's mouth shut. Kyle looked to Marcus. "Bring Leora." Marcus hesitated. "Your Majesty, the council." Kyle cut him off. "Open the door." No one argued, because there are moments when even politics recognizes something older than power. A child's life. Leora returned almost immediately, pale, breathless, but moving faster, as Rowan's roars shook the wing. Marcus stopped her at the threshold for half a heartbeat. "Are you sure?" Leora met his gaze. "I told you, I won't leave him." The iron door opened. Cold, chaotic air spilled out. Rowan stood in the center of the chamber, body rigid, eyes red-rimmed, breath ragged. He looked like he'd been fighting an invisible war and losing. Leora didn't run to him. She didn't rush and overwhelm him. She stepped inside and lowered herself to the stone in the place she always sat. No commands, no scolding, no apology that would make him feel guilty. Just one sentence spoken softly like a candle lit in a storm. "I'm here." Rowan froze. His growl fractured into a smaller sound, uncertain. Then he lunged. The guards outside tightened their grips on weapons. But Rowan didn't attack. He slammed into Leora's arms like a child falling into the only safe place left in the world. Leora caught him, arms wrapping around his shoulders, her body rocked backward by his weight. Rowan buried his face in her neck, breathing hard, claws gripping her dress, as if anchoring himself to reality. Leora stroked the back of his head. "I know," she whispered, "I know. I'm sorry you thought I was gone." The corridor fell silent. Kyle watched it, and something inside him ached so fiercely he couldn't speak. Because he understood finally Rowan didn't need discipline first. Rowan needed assurance. When Rowan finally calmed, he stayed close, half curled beside Leora, one hand still clutching the hem of her skirt. Cale stepped into the chamber slowly, like approaching a wild animal, except the animal was his own son, and that truth made everything harder. Rowan lifted his head and growled once low in warning. Leora didn't restrain him with force. She placed a hand on Rowan's shoulder. "It's okay," she told him. "He isn't here to take me away." Rowan's body remained tense, but he didn't attack. Kyle stopped a few paces away. His voice was quieter than normal. "How did you do it?" Leora looked at Rowan, then Kyle. "I didn't do anything grand." "He doesn't let anyone near," Kyle said, almost to himself. "Because everyone who comes near tries to control him," Leora replied. Kyle's silence was immediate. Leora continued gently but plainly. "I don't see him as a problem to fix." Kyle stared at Rowan, at the child lying under Leora's hand like he belonged there. Leora's voice softened. "A child who is always called a monster will eventually believe the only way to survive is to act like one." Kale's gaze dropped. For a moment, he looked less like a king and more like a man who had been struck by the exact truth he'd avoided his entire life, and that's where something shifted between them. Not romance yet, not longing, but respect, real heavy, undeniable respect. From that day on, Kyle stopped watching only from the corridor. At first, he stood near the door while Leora played with Rowan. He didn't enter, didn't force his presence. He simply listened. Leora's voice stayed the same whether she spoke to Rowan or to the Alpha King. "Not too hard," she would say to Rowan as they tugged the rope. "If you want to pull, use your hands too. You're doing well," she'd murmur, when Rowan's growl threatened to rise. "Slow down. No one is taking anything from you." Kale noticed that. The steadiness. Most people changed their voice around power. They hardened, or they sweetened, or they bent into flattery. Leora did none of that. One afternoon, Rowan flung the rope toward Kale. The room snapped tense. Even Selene inhaled sharply. Leora laughed softly. "He wants you to play." Kyle blinked. Leora looked at him without fear. "If you refuse, he'll think you're afraid of him?" Kyle wasn't used to servants speaking like that. He should have been offended. Instead, he felt challenged in a way that didn't insult him. He bent down and picked up the rope. Rowan growled low, but didn't attack. Leora's voice came gently, lightly. Kyle tugged once. Rowan tugged back. And for the first time, there was an interaction between father and son that was not command, not restraint, not fear. Just play. Kyle made a sound short, involuntary, a laugh barely there. Rowan tilted his head as if the sound was the strangest thing he'd ever heard. Leora glanced at Kale, and for the first time she didn't see only a cold alpha. She saw a man who had forgotten what it was to breathe without armor. Their closeness didn't explode. It didn't become a sudden confession or a dramatic touch. It grew slowly through the shared language of staying. The council did not stop pressing. Rathos had scribes record every visit, every minute Leora spent in Rowan's chamber, turning care into evidence of manipulation. Mara Kestrel, head of the servants, cornered Leora one morning and hissed, "Remember who you are. Don't let a few days of attention make you dream above your station." Leora's reply was quiet. "I'm not dreaming above. I'm refusing to turn my back on a child." Mara sneered. "Kindness won't protect you in this palace." Leora looked toward Rowan's wing. "Maybe not, but it's protected him a little." That line reached Kale's ears within a day. He didn't confront Mara. He didn't make a public show. He simply replaced the guards at Rowan's door with Marcus's most loyal men. No one would drag Leora away again without stepping over the Alpha King's authority. Late one night, Rowan slept with his head near Leora's knee rope still clutched in his hand like a talisman. Kyle stood a few paces away. Rowan no longer growled him out of the room. Leora lifted her gaze. "He's better." Kyle looked at Rowan, then at her. Not only him. Leora's brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Kale didn't answer immediately. He looked around the chamber, the chains still hanging on the wall. The old seals faded, but visible the marks in the stone where Rowan had clawed at his own prison. Then he looked at Leora's hand resting lightly on Rowan's shoulder, his voice lowered. "I thought I needed stronger methods to control him." He paused as if choosing words he was not used to saying. "But maybe what I needed was to learn how to stay." Leora held his gaze a little longer than politeness required. And in that pause, something warmer than gratitude began to form. Not claimed, not commanded, chosen. Rathos did not allow peace to last. In the council chamber, he slammed a stack of observation notes onto the table. "Everything we've seen happens in a sealed room, in her presence, under her influence." Celine's voice sharpened. "It's not influence. Rowan has learned safety." Rathos turned to Kyle with cold triumph. "Then prove it before the entire pack." Marcus frowned hard. "It's too soon." Rathos didn't care. "If he is heir, he must stand before his people. If he cannot, we must know now." Kyle stared at Rathos for a long time. "Do you want a test?" Kyle asked quietly, "or a public execution wearing the mask of tradition?" Rathos bowed. "I want to protect the kingdom." Kale knew the trap. If he refused, they'd keep calling Rowan a monster. If he agreed, he would put his son under 100 fearful eyes and risk shattering everything Leora had built. Leora stood beside Kale, quiet. Rowan sat close at her feet, rope in hand. Kyle looked at her. "What do you think?" The entire council went still because an Alpha King asking a servant girl's opinion was the kind of crack that could split a court. Leora looked down at Rowan, then back up. "If you bring him out to prove he isn't a monster," she said softly, "don't treat him like one before it begins." Kyle held her gaze, then nodded once. "Then we do it your way." The training arena was prepared the next morning. No chains, no cage, no ring of spears. Still guards lined every exit hands tight on weapons. Fear has habits, and it doesn't drop them overnight. The entire pack gathered, nobles, warriors, servants, even children perched behind their parents' legs with wide eyes. Rumors buzzed. The monster prince will be released. The servant girl will die. The Alpha King has gone soft. Leora stood at the arena's edge with nothing in her hands but Rowan's old cloth rope. Marcus approached, voice low. "If something happens, I'll pull you away." Leora looked at him. "If you pull me away too soon, Rowan will think I abandoned him again." Marcus fell silent. Leora added softer. "Look at his eyes before you look at his claws." Marcus exhaled almost a surrender. "You talk like it's easy." "It isn't," Leora said, "but it's necessary." The eastern doors opened. Rowan walked out between two warriors. He wasn't chained, but the crowd stepped back instinctively with every stride he took. He was too big, too sharp-edged, too raw with power. Rowan stopped in the center of the arena, his ears pinned back, his breath quickened. Too many scents, too many eyes, too much fear pointed at him like spears. A child in the crowd cried out, startled by the tension. Rowan's head snapped toward the sound. Weapons lifted. Rathos stood high on the platform and said coldly, "Begin." Rowan roared. The crowd shuddered. Kyle took one step forward by instinct. Leora raised a hand, not touching him, just signaling. "Don't walk in like a king," she murmured without looking back. "He'll think he's already done something wrong." Kale froze. Leora stepped into the arena. The crowd went silent so fast it felt like someone had stolen the air. Leora did not kneel. She did not bark commands. She walked slowly, letting Rowan see each movement, each shift in her body, each breath. An elder whispered, "She truly isn't afraid," Selene answered, voice thick with emotion. "She is afraid. She just refuses to let fear lead." Rowan growled, low claws, scraping dirt. Leora stopped at a distance that did not pressure him and did not abandon him. She lifted the rope. Rowan's focus locked on it like a starving creature recognizing food. Leora smiled gently like she would on any quiet afternoon. "It's crowded today," she said to Rowan, conversational. "I don't like being stared at either." People blinked, confused. "Who talked to the prince like that?" Leora continued, voice warm. "It's okay. We'll do what we always do." She tossed the rope onto the ground between them, not at him, not as a challenge, just as an invitation. She tilted her head. "Want to play?" For one heartbeat? No one breathed. Rowan stared at the rope, then at Leora. He took a step forward. Shields rose. Leora didn't turn her head. Her voice carried clearly. "Don't raise shields. He'll think you're going to hit him." Marcus gritted his teeth but signaled for them to lower. Rowan took another step. Then he lunged. The crowd screamed. Kale moved fast, instinct screaming through him. But Rowan didn't attack Leora. He snapped his jaws around the rope, not her body. Leora caught the other end and tugged lightly. Rowan tugged back, and Leora laughed, small, bright, unbelievably human. "That's it," she said, "easy." Rowan pulled again, eyes intent, breath harsh but not enraged. He was playing. A servant covered her mouth with both hands. "He's playing." Celine's eyes glistened. "Yes," she whispered, "he's playing." On the platform, Rathos went pale, because the monster he'd tried to define was unraveling in front of everyone. After several pulls, Rowan's shoulders loosened. His breath slowed. Leora glanced toward Kale. He understood, but hesitation held him for a fraction. "Fear is stubborn even in kings," slow Leora mouthed. Kale stepped into the arena. The crowd parted automatically. He did not stride in like an alpha. He walked like a man approaching something sacred and fragile. Rowan stopped pulling, his gaze fixed on Kyle. Tension returned like a tide. Kyle stopped a few paces away. Then he did what no one expected. He knelt, not to the council, not to politics, to his son. So his eyes were level with Rowan's. Kyle's voice came out rough. "Rowan." Rowan growled low. Kyle did not move closer. "I'm sorry," Kyle said. The arena froze. An alpha king apologizing in front of the pack was unthinkable. It was vulnerability, raw and dangerous. Kale opened his hand palm up. "I was afraid of you, and because I was afraid, I left you alone." Rowan stared at the offered hand. Then he flicked his eyes to Leora. Leora gave a tiny nod, barely visible. "He's asking," she said softly, "not ordering." Rowan moved forward slowly as if stepping onto thin ice. His nose touched Kale's palm. Kyle held perfectly still. Then Rowan pressed his forehead into his father's hand. No bite, no flinch, no roar. Kyle shut his eyes and his hand trembled as he finally touched his son, Not through chains, not through seals, but through choice. It was not a king's triumph. It was a father's homecoming. Rathos tried to reclaim the moment with words. One moment proves nothing. Kyle didn't turn his head. His voice cut through the arena like a blade. Enough. Rathos froze. Kyle stood, his hand resting lightly on Rowan's shoulder, light enough to be permission, not control. From this day, Kale said, voice ringing, "No one in this palace will call my son a monster again." Rowan stood between Kale and Leora, rope still in hand, his posture calmer than anyone had ever seen in public. Kale looked out over the pack. "He is your prince," Kale said. "He is my son, and he is a child." No one argued, because the truth was standing in the dirt, breathing real. When the crowd finally drifted away, the arena was left with only a handful: Kale, Leora, Rowan, Marcus, and Celine. Rowan stayed close to Leora, but he glanced occasionally at Kale as if learning what trust looked like. Kyle approached Leora. She instinctively began to bow, servant training rising like reflex. Kale gently lifted a hand, not touching her, just stopping the motion. "Don't." Leora stilled. Kale's eyes were no longer judging. They were changed, softer around the edges. "You saved Rowan," he said. "I just stayed," Leora replied. Kyle shook his head. "No. You did what I couldn't." Leora fell silent. Kyle continued, voice quieter. "You saved me too." Leora's breath caught. Kyle didn't step into her space. He'd learned something from her. Gentleness required room for the other person to choose. "Stay, Leora." Her fingers tightened around the rope. Kyle's voice deepened with sincerity. "Not as a servant, not because I command it. I'm asking." Leora looked at Rowan. His eyes were fixed on her with that familiar fear. "Don't disappear." "I don't belong here," she whispered. Kale's answer was immediate, almost fierce, with quiet conviction. "Then let me build a place where you do." Leora searched his face for arrogance, for entitlement. She found none. Only a man who had knelt in the dirt for his child and meant every word he said. "If the council resists," she asked. Kale's first response was blunt. "They will accept it." Then he corrected himself softer. "No, I will protect what is right before I demand others accept it." Leora's eyes warmed, emotion threatening. Rowan tugged her sleeve gently and spoke, broken, hoarse, but clear enough to shatter every wall in the world. "Stay." Leora froze. Kale froze too. It was one of the first words Rowan had ever offered instead of roared. Leora knelt in front of Rowan and wrapped her arms around him. "I'm staying," she promised. Rowan buried his face into her shoulder. Kyle stood beside them, his expression softening into something that looked dangerously like peace. The sealed chamber stopped being a prison. Chains were removed, seals were wiped away. The door no longer locked from the outside. The room was remade into something it had never been: a child's space. Soft rugs, simple toys, cloth ropes braided by Leora's hands. Windows opened wider. Light allowed in. Rowan still startled at loud noises. He still didn't like strangers too close. Healing did not erase fear overnight, but he was no longer treated like an omen. Kale began coming every evening, not to inspect, not to command, but to sit on the floor and play. One day, Rowan tugged the rope hard enough that Kale nearly lost his balance and had to catch himself with a hand. Leora laughed, bright and teasing. "Your Majesty, you lost." Kale glanced at Rowan, then at Leora. "Perhaps losing like this isn't so terrible." Rowan made a small, pleased sound, half chuff, half laugh. And for a moment, the palace that once trembled with roars felt almost warm. That night, moonlight spilled across the inner courtyard like silver water. Rowan sat between Kyle and Leora, leaning his head on Leora's shoulder, while his smaller hand held Kyle's uncertain but present. No chains, no seals, no desperate roars. Only the steady breath of a child who had finally found people who did not walk away. Rowan lifted his head and looked at Leora. "Stay." Leora smoothed his hair back gently. "I promised," she whispered. Kyle stood behind them for a moment, watching no longer the cold king of stone corridors, but a man learning how to belong in his own family, and he smiled. Not the smile of victory, the smile of someone who, after a long winter, had finally found the way home. If there's one thing this story keeps pressing into my chest as I write it, it's this: aggression is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is grief with nowhere to go. A monster is often just a child who learned that fear gets attention faster than tears. Shadowrest tried to fix Rowan with chains and seals because control feels safer than understanding. But control without connection is just another kind of abandonment, polished, justified, and deadly. Leora didn't tame Rowan. She didn't win by being stronger. She won by doing something most people refuse to do. When they're scared, she stayed. And in the end, the greatest power in the palace wasn't an alpha's dominance. It was the courage to look at teeth and still choose to see the frightened child beneath them. Thank you for staying with this story, one that reminds us how love can reach even where fear has built walls. If this moment touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and see what part stayed with you the most. A simple like or subscribe helps more stories like this find their way to others who need them. And if you're not ready to leave just yet, there are more powerful stories waiting for you right here.